There we go. And that we will do Q&A, question and answer, after Dennis finishes. If you have any questions or comments, for that matter, feel free to put them in the question place, not the chat interface. Use the question interface. We don't usually look too closely at the chat box, if you will. So use the question area to ask any pertinent questions that you may have. Dennis, why don't you take it away? Is there anything else I've forgotten?
You hit the record button. That's the main part of it. So thanks for the introduction, Doug. Let's go ahead and get started. I keep wondering why I'm supposed to be doing this. I guess a remnant of when I was a state climatologist. For those that didn't know, I was the state climatologist in South Dakota for 13 years before taking on this role. So enjoy this, but also enjoy being a state climatologist, and also enjoy getting to do webinars like this, because it is fun to pull pieces together and kind of share what's going on over time. So, just a reminder of where we can find access to future webinars and the recorded webinars, and to point out that next month we will be going with Dr. Justin Glisson, the state climatologist for Iowa at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, on May 16th, that same time again next month. So both located in Iowa, but I'm regional, he's state. So agenda, typical agenda, kind of current conditions, a quick review, touch on some wide-ranging impacts, and then we'll look at the outlook for what's coming up ahead. And share a photo shared with us by Becky Bollinger from the Colorado Climate Office. She, I think, found it kind of humorous that the atmospheric science campus at Fort Collins, the sign was damaged by some very strong winds, which we will touch on as we go along here. So kind of a quick review of where we've been the last 3 months. March, from a temperature standpoint ranking, we were again on the warm side throughout nearly the whole region, except for Montana and North Dakota, which were on the warm side but not considered above average. And the eastern parts of the region well into the warm category. Top 10 warmest Marches for most of the eastern states. And just a note that Doug had reminded me earlier that globally we are in the 10th month in a row of being much warmer than average. So continuing not only here, but this same situation going on globally. It was interesting with we have a call with a bunch of partners the day before, getting some details from different states, and they mentioned March being warmer, but not as crazy warm as I think the Minnesota folks said throughout much of the winter. So we're still running above average, just not as far above average as we had been. From a March precipitation standpoint, again, as often happens with precipitation, a real mixed bag. Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Wyoming, and Colorado were all on the wetter side. Not on the extreme wet side, but definitely on the wetter side overall. While South Dakota, Kansas, and Kentucky were all on the dry side. Again, not extremes, but somewhat drier comparatively. The rest of the states were somewhere in the middle of the road. Then if we combine these and look at the last 3 months, so the end of winter and the start of spring here, those numbers go up for the eastern Corn Belt and all the way up around in this case. So top 10 warmest January through March for most of the eastern states. Michigan and Wisconsin, number 2, Minnesota, number 3, Iowa, number 4, Illinois, number 5. And those are different because we have 130 years of record. So you kind of have to do a counting routine there to kind of figure out where we are. All the states were above average. It was the northeastern states that were the highest overall from a temperature standpoint. And again, mentioning how that was, March was warm, just not quite as warm overall comparatively for the winter as a whole. And then the January through March precipitation, again, kind of middle of the road overall, though we were drier in some places. Dakotas and Minnesota were on the dry side. The northern areas particularly were lack of snow in this time frame. That's why they were so dry overall. We'll talk about that more as we go along. Colorado was the 11th wettest. They have had a pretty good winter overall from a precipitation standpoint, a lot of snowpack, and we'll touch on that as we go along. Then just a quick update, since we're in the middle of the month, last 30 days, precipitation on the left-hand side, percent of normal on the right-hand side. Kind of a more active pattern from northwest to southeast across the region, central plains and into Missouri, and then the far northern areas all running below average. So the central plains, something to be very aware of. The northern areas, despite being somewhat drier, that didn't seem to be a major concern yet, as this time of year is still relatively dry comparatively up in the far northern areas. And we'll talk about some of the wetness that's showing up in the eastern side of the region here as we go along. Departure from normal temperature the last 30 days. As we mentioned briefly, we have been warmer than average, kind of this from Wyoming, Colorado on around to the eastern areas, but not crazy warm. The tannish area down here is 2 to 4 degrees above average. Northern plains has been a little bit below average. Again, not too bad, but a little more within range than what we saw throughout most of the rest of the winter. The other thing we want to point out, and this will be an underlying factor as we talk about a few things, is some of the longer term dryness. I showed you the graphic earlier that some of the areas centered around Iowa have been a bit wetter recently, wetter than average. But if you look in longer context, we still have some issues from a longer perspective. This is the departure from normal going back to a year ago. So we have this area from southeastern Minnesota all the way down to Missouri and a little bit east of there that are running 10 to 15 and in some places close to 20 inches below average over the last year, which is pretty significant. And then if we look at that over a 3-year period, what same time period, last 3 years, we go well into the 20 inches below average. And there are places in here we go 30 inches below average. We don't show those because the contouring doesn't reach that point. So some very long-term deficits in this central part of our region here. Now, we're not going to make up all that and need to make up all that before we say drought is done. That's not the way this works. But we are very aware that we need to make up some of these longer-term deficits. And these issues are showing up in some of the impacts that we've seen. So we'll talk about those as we go along. So a few more things that are a little less climate-y and more impact related. It has been we don't think it's a very active severe weather season. We had some discussion yesterday about how active it could be. There's still some question about that. But from the area from Missouri over to the eastern Corn Belt along the Ohio River, it has been a fairly active wet period so far, with some pockets also to the northern areas. In addition to not getting as much precipitation, there hasn't been much severe weather up north, and it's still a little bit early for that. From an Ohio standpoint, we had a report. Ohio's had 28 tornadoes already. Their annual average is 20, so we're well ahead of that already. There has been some ag damage, and here's a picture down below from Hans Schmitz in southwestern Indiana on some tornado damage. They had an outbreak that went across Kentucky, southwestern Indiana, part of southern Ohio that did some damage. In addition to some of the severe weather tornadic kinds of things and hail, we've had some fairly extensive straight line winds. The biggest one is out of Colorado on April 6th and 7th. That picture I showed from the Fort Collins Atmospheric Science Campus, they had 80 to 90 mile per hour wind gusts in Colorado, and it also caused some potential issues. One, down power lines, but also there were other areas where power was cut in advance of this to avoid potential down power lines setting off any fires. Fortunately, it didn't set off any fires, but it did cause some lack of electricity issues. And then there have been some other reports in the Central Plains with some combination of storms and outside storm wind events, some 70 mile per hour gusts under some wind events. So a fairly active season so far to start off. We can't forget, this is why I kind of enjoy doing this time of year, we've got spring severe weather. We have snow that we still have going on. We had a blizzard, or a couple big snow events. April 6th and 7th, we had a blizzard in Nebraska and South Dakota. Here's a picture on the right-hand side from Sioux County, Nebraska, up to 10 inches, I believe, of snow, along with some very strong winds. Caused a lot of blowing, drifting, travel issues, and some calf losses. An overall hardship for livestock folks, but some calf losses were reported with that. And then there was another snowstorm that moved across all parts of South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, also in early April. In parts of Minnesota, this doubled their cold season snow total, which shows you how little snow there was and how big this event was. The graphic down here below shows the snow on the ground on April 3rd. Overall, you can kind of see the area in Wisconsin. Some of the stuff was melting off already out of Minnesota. This melt-off did actually add to soil moisture. We have had an unfrozen ground. We've had that through much of the winter. So the snows that we've had have melted and helped our overall soil moisture situation. And then we also have fire issues. The pictures here are from fire on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, picked up from social media. In addition to that one, which I think still maybe not quite wrapped up yet, but I believe it is contained. There's lots of small starts and in places that we typically don't think about fire being an issue: northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In fact, some information shared with me by Molly Wolazin from NIDIS. Michigan is reporting so far this year 34 fires, 155 acres burned, 2 residences, and 4 outbuildings. For comparison, this time last year, they'd only had 4 fires reported. So none of them very big, but has been some damage related to that. And part of this is the dryness, lack of snow, but then also we haven't had a green up in that area to be able to limit some of the issues. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on to touching on we talked about drought already. Let's hit on where we are with that. Here's where we are with the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is the continental U.S. look. This again was released this morning, valid for Tuesday morning. And you can see that our region, the central part of the U.S., is one of the couple areas with still some remnant parts of serious drought going on. Areas from Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas is another region. We are at a low, the amount of coverage nationally is down quite a bit from where we've been the last few years after the La Niñas, but we still do have part of our area with some issues going on. Let's zoom that up over the region. You get a little closer look. Kansas up to Nebraska, Iowa, still some D3 going on in Nebraska. And those areas I pointed out as being dry to the north, from North Dakota, Minnesota, and parts of the UP of Michigan. Ongoing dryness since last fall, real lack of snow up in that area overall. And then the eastern Corn Belt, you see a lot of white. And that's the area we've seen quite a bit more precipitation and has eliminated a lot of the drought in that area. And we'll talk more about some of the wetness issues that we have going on there from a hydrologic standpoint, which we'll go to right now. Some of the overall water issues, hydrologic water issues, and some lack of water issues that we still have going on. This is a condition monitoring report image from Texas County, Missouri. And just a side note that people who may be wondering from a drought standpoint, things they can do, we encourage people, they can be part of CoCoRaHS. We don't talk about CoCoRaHS on here. That's citizen science. You can measure precipitation and report precipitation that gets used by us and other folks who contribute to the drought monitor. Or in this case, this is a way of reporting conditions in your area, showing what's going on, taking pictures like in this case, and comparing those over time for what's happening overall. So from a stream flow standpoint, here's where we are as of Tuesday, last 7-day average. Lots of blue and black in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, in the upper Ohio Valley, where they've had some heavier rainfalls. Aaron Wilson from Ohio mentioned 5 to 10 inches, I believe, so far this month. Eliminated a lot of dryness and has led to some water issues we'll talk about as we go along. Looking to the east, we have dryness definitely over Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Iowa, with some record low or low for that gauge flows. And then that northern area from North Dakota all the way over to northern Michigan, where we have some overall low flows going on. Connected with that, part of the hydrologic, what's going on in the way of soil moisture, similar dryness to the stream flow. We have 2 different national soil moisture models, and these are percentile based, basically kind of a ranking scale. Where do they rank on, for example, 100 years of data? that we would be ranking well into the dry category from Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and over in that area, and then some up north. You do see a few differences between the two models as you compare. There's the NASA model on the lower left-hand side seems to have something going on around the Great Lakes that it doesn't quite resolve very well, and then varying levels of wetness depending on where you're looking at compared across the east. And then the lower right-hand side is the USDA NASS, National Ag Statistics, reports from reporters on how much of the topsoil moisture, according to reporters as of Sunday, are short to very short. The eastern states, very little is considered short to very short. Increasing amounts as you go to the central area, and then Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, a bit North Dakota, and a bit out in the plains, with up to in the 50s or 65% reported short to very short in Kansas, where we've had some of the more recent dryness going on here. Looking again further west now, where are we in the way of snow? And from a snowpack standpoint, that leads to mainly what's in the Missouri River. So, and I've kind of circled the basins that are on the eastern slopes of the Rockies and where they are. Pretty common message, northern areas that lead into the upper Missouri. All of them are a decent amount below average overall. The difference is when you get down to Wyoming and Colorado, we're closer to average. These go into the Platte River, and so that will make it to the Missouri. The difference is the Platte River comes in below all the Missouri River dams, so it will add to stream flow, but that can't be held back for some of the drier periods. So the areas up here that are coming in lower, and we'll go ahead and show you those graphics here on where we are in the way of snowpack coming into the upper Missouri. The left is above Fort Peck, and on the right, Fort Peck to Garrison. The red line is the average accumulation, and we are right now at about that average peak accumulation, so we would expect to start falling off after this point. And then we have the record high, which in this case is, what is the record high one? It doesn't list here what the record high one and the record low one on the green. And especially above Fort Peck, we're running close to the record low overall. Fort Peck to Garrison is somewhat between the record low and the average, but that gives you some perspective on what we've got going into the Missouri River that are in the Missouri River dam system. And then here's where we are on the North Platte and South Platte, running slightly above average, but again, getting near that peak and starting to fall off here on the South Platte, maybe on the North Platte overall also. And then the big water bodies on up to our northeast, where are we on the Great Lakes? Reports from the Great Lakes folks were nothing untoward to talk about, other than really there being no ice left to speak of in the lakes overall, and some of the southern areas are starting to warm up. The lakes are warming up fairly quickly for where we are right now. The other thing just to mention that has been something of issue as we've gone through the year, and something that we know we need to talk about more, and something that we're not, that we don't expect to be an issue in the wintertime, but has been. Mentioned earlier, winter has been very warm. Warm enough to the point where soils were not frozen, and warm enough to the point where we have to consider evaporation from the soils with the water that was getting on the soils. Still not a huge amount, but certainly something to take into account. And two measures and two products that we have that assess how much demand or how much we're potentially losing water from the surface. On the left-hand side is EDDI. It's an evaporative demand index, and it doesn't give you an absolute amount leaving the surface, but rates it on the drought monitor category. So from Missouri over to the Eastern Corn Belt, we've had what would be D1 to D2 in some areas of evaporative demand, adding to the issue. Northern areas really have not been showing much of anything on one way or the other, so really nothing too much to speak of there overall. So along with some of the dryness, we are drying out a little bit because of additional evaporative demand. How much would we be looking at? Well, this is a product on the right-hand side, which I forgot to include the URL for. I should probably fix that. The URL is over on the right-hand side here. You can kind of see there. That is a daily potential evapotranspiration kind of a theoretical upper limit about how much water could be lost from the surface over the last month, March 18th to April 16th. And those southern areas could be losing up to 3 inches of water. This area across, from southern Minnesota, Wisconsin to Michigan, up to 2 inches of water. Probably not that amount, but enough that we have to take note of what's happening in this situation. So kind of wrapping around various water issues, Great Lakes ice is gone. The Minnesota folks, we're reporting there's a little bit of ice still left despite the warm winter in that area. That heavier rain has been producing some tributary flooding, and also on the Ohio River, barge traffic has been slowed a little bit because of the high water on the Ohio River. That is receding right now, pending any kind of further decent rainfalls. The overall, the dryness far north, largely a lack of snow and a lack of runoff, which will, kind of compound in some of the downstream issues. The Mississippi overall is okay for now, because especially of the inflow from the Ohio River and some from the Illinois River, but it's definitely being monitored for what could be happening later in the season, because these longer term drier issues, we still don't have a lot of base flow available for input. Missouri River is still okay, but low inflows we talked about, and that longer term dryness is still definitely an issue. Okay, jumping to my favorite area, the agricultural impacts overall. The one thing we want to point out, and this is should be looping for you, what's happening. This is a graphic from the National Phenology Network down at the University of Arizona, I believe. Yes, University of Arizona and USGS. This is a first leaf index, basically showing kind of when spring started and how early that was from a comparison standpoint. And you can see that the reddish colors were, 15 to 20 days early in some cases. And that fit with a number of what folks were talking about as being 2 weeks plus early on dormancy break from various plants. The colder temperatures recently have slowed that northward movement, but still well above average, and has put us in some concern because we still have risk for frost freeze, which we'll talk about more as we go along here. From a soil temperature standpoint, soil temperatures actually are in pretty good shape for most of what would be planted. We are at a time when most of the row crop planting can be getting started, except for some of the northern areas. We are at or above 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout much of this area and south. Still cooler north, but that's not unexpected, given they do run a little bit cooler overall and take a little bit longer to warm up. And the overall lack of, we're not incredibly wet, our soils are not incredibly wet, which does slow the warm up, and the overall warm winter have all contributed to keeping soil temperatures above where we are. Run through a few crop maps here for you. USDA NAS, the winter wheat conditions. Where we are in progress on the lower right-hand side, we do have some winter wheat starting to head already. A report from southwestern Indiana, Hans Schmitz, mentioned that they do have wheat starting to head down in that area, and mentioned could be very early progress on getting winter wheat out of the ground, which will allow plenty of time for putting in another crop after this, as many of them would want to do. Northern area is still not much in the way of winter wheat heading. Overall, on the lower left-hand side, conditions are pretty good. Kansas running somewhat lower and has decreased in the last week, as had South Dakota, also up in Montana. So some of the dryness is starting to show some problems up in that area. With the cold that is expected, there is cold that is expected to be coming this weekend. For those of you who are watching this in real time, that could be a potential issue. It doesn't look to be severe cold, and doesn't look like wheat is going to be far enough along to be much of a problem. And then the other crops, some of the other crops, the only other major one, oats, not a major crop, but is, planted fairly well already. Spring wheat is another earlier spring planted, 23% in South Dakota, lesser in some of the northern states. And then corn and soybeans are, planted somewhat, 6% planted overall nationally, most of the southern tier, Missouri, Kansas, a little bit in some of the other states, and then soybeans also some small percentages planted. Note that we did have some people talking yesterday about people who did put corn or soybeans in the ground as early as late February and some in early March. Sometimes it's just tests, sometimes it's just trying to beat things and see if they can make it happen. So far, it hasn't been damaged too much. It's been able to make it work. These numbers will start creeping up very quickly as we go along here with warmer conditions coming. So again, very early phenology, 2 to 3 weeks ahead, nearly everywhere. Early planting has started, not as quick as I would expect, but with warmer conditions coming, I will expect to see it coming along. Some wetter soils in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, Indiana, Ohio, may slow things down a little bit. Most other places, nobody's reporting any problems so far. There are some dryness issues, but at least initially, we're not too concerned. There are drought concerns still hanging on, and we mentioned the freeze possibly coming this weekend. Okay, that gets us through. Now let's talk about where we could be heading from an overall perspective. If you're a common watcher or listener to this, we do talk about the situation with El Niño, La Niña, not because it controls everything, but it does influence something we can say about the outlooks, and it does influence what the Climate Prediction Center puts in their outlooks. Where we are right now is on the left-hand side in this March, April, May area. These across the bottom are 3-month periods. That's how we classify things according to El Niño, La Niña. The red is saying that we are still in La Niña, or excuse me, still in El Niño, which is red. And then we currently, but very quickly, in fact, within the next couple of weeks, you may see reports that the El Niño may be officially declared done with some rapidly changing sea surface temperatures. So that April, May, June, and then May, June, July are likely neutral conditions. That doesn't mean average. That we're only talking about what's going on with El Niño, La Niña. And then by June, July, August, September, La Niña becomes the more likely outcome and increasingly likely as we go on, which does give us pause and make us, we should watch this very closely because this does influence what we're going to be saying in the outlooks. Okay, fortunately, if people are watching NOAA products, we've had some NOAA product problems this week with some data issues, and fortunately, this map just updated a couple hours ahead of time. It had not been updated for the last couple days. 7-day precipitation forecast. I mentioned from a temperature standpoint, we've got some cold coming following this large system that has just passed through us. We're going to have some colder temperatures throughout most of the region into the weekend, and then we start with a fairly quick warm up we'll talk about here in just a second. Along with that, next 7 days, some 1 to 2 inch amounts, more so focused around Missouri. Again, these are some of the drier areas, and on up towards Illinois, Indiana. It doesn't look like major amounts overall, maybe as much as a couple inches. Northern areas, which could use some more rainfall, still are running overall on the dry side. Then we jump ahead to week 2, the 8 to 14 day, and on the left-hand side, lots of red through the central part of the country. Increasingly likely, a big ridge builds across the central U.S., bringing much more likely warmer than average temperatures. So very warm, nice springtime temperatures. We'll probably, again, continue warm soils and dry some soils out. So we will continue to see ag activities increase and perennials continue to green up and move ahead. Along with that, we do have some increased chances for precipitation. That's the way these products have been running recently. Hasn't always panned out, but that's what this is saying right now, that as we go through the end of the month, we have, again, increased chances for precipitation, which is overall a good thing given the overall dryness. We jump ahead now to the 30-day outlook for May 1 to May 31. Most of the Great Lakes and eastern part of the region have increased chances for above average. Plains, equal chances, means we don't have indications towards wet or dry. Just kind of where we're looking at in the way of from a May standpoint. And then the area of increased precipitation is very small, mostly central plains along the Ohio Valley, and this is a very slight tilt towards the above average side. So really nothing more, really not too much we can say in the way of precipitation for the month of May overall. Then we do to the 90-day, May, June, July, and again, better chances for warmer than average. over the most of the eastern areas. Still a pocket of equal chances in the northern plains, and still not a lot we're seeing on the way of precipitation overall, a little bit along the Ohio Valley. And then we jump into, well, July, late summer outlook, I should say, July through September. Again, leaning towards the warm side overall, but then a very large area of not strong chances, but leaning towards the dry side. And this is the La Niña influence showing itself. As La Niña does become more entrenched by late summer, it does increase our chances of overall heat and does increase our chances of overall dryness, central and western parts of the region. So, you know, the kind of take home here is, if your soil moisture is in good shape right now, it's maybe, you know, maybe the risk is not too bad. If your soil moisture is on the dry side, the chances of increased heat and dryness should give us some pause and make us keep an eye on things more closely, and make some smart decisions ahead of this to plan ahead for this possibility. From a water standpoint, we would encourage people to be doing that same kind of thing. The chances for dryness are not as strong in the eastern Corn Belt as they are out in the plains area. And then last thing, from a fire standpoint, the wildfire potential, maintain some increased wildfire potential throughout the month. We're halfway through this month already. The areas in red show increased, and then also parts of Colorado and Kansas for some of the dryness down there. I didn't include any of the other maps because there is no significant wildfire potential in the region for any of the multiple months afterwards. We'll continue to update those as we look ahead, but for right now, this is the only time period we still see some increased risk right now, but then the wildfire potential should decrease as we go along. So, quick summary here. Drought improvement, a little bit wet towards the east, and you know, generally improved overall. Some degradation has been occurring in parts of Kansas, Missouri, where we've had some dryness going on. Overall, good ag conditions. People reporting on the ground, no major concerns right now. For perennials, we are monitoring perennials or winter wheat, are monitoring the freeze potential coming up, again, as I mentioned, in real time this coming weekend. Overall, there doesn't seem to be major concern about this because there's not too much at risk and the temperatures don't look like they're going to go too cold, but it does bear watching. Fire issues are still with us. The green up as things get warmer will help, and rivers okay for now, especially the major rivers, but they are going to bear watching. From an outlook standpoint, the El Nino is going to be weakening and moving to La Niña by summer. So that definitely bears watching. We're going through what's called a rapid transition, and there are some increased risk from a drought standpoint, and even more on a heat standpoint during some of these. So we'll continue talking about these as we go along and make sure we're updating as we're happening. The drought risk is still apparent if the heat and dryness does continue as it could. You know, the drought risk will increase and could probably see some resurgence of drought. Better precipitation chances are probably early in the growing season rather than mid-late growing season because of that La Niña influence. And that is, you know, leading to more concern in the growing season, likely partially because of the chance for conditions and partially because we still have some soils that are fairly dry. The common thing that we're hearing in some of these longer term dry places, you know, the upper soil has wetted up and is in good shape, but deeper in that profile, especially for crops will reach 4, 5, even sometimes feet deeper into the soil profile to extract moisture if it needs it. And deeper in that profile, it's still probably dry in some of these cases, and that's why we're also monitoring the groundwater issues because of the lack of enough water to improve that situation. Okay, just a bunch of links again to our partners, and thank you to the partners who all help make this happen for us. It is a great collaboration among a bunch of climate services partners across the region. And thank yous and some contact information for people who can help provide more information regionally. So thanks for being here, and yeah, let's go ahead and get on to questions.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Let's stress that summer is a really difficult time, anytime to make predictions and forecasts for. But there's been a few different folks and a few different papers and a couple of people on this call, as a matter of fact, who probably could comment on tendencies across the Midwest and the high plains, northern high plains, of what's common when we move from a relatively strong El Nino situation to a relatively, well, we don't know, but could be a moderate to strong La Nina. And a few of those things, as Dennis mentioned, are already showing up a little bit on the outlooks. So the warmth, especially to the west, western half of the north central part of the U.S., and the potential for warm temperatures and some dryness creeping in there. And so Dennis made the point of saying that we may get the bulk, and this is pretty common, we may get the bulk of our precipitation, obviously, from now until mid-June. Beyond that, it tends to be more hit and miss. This year may be more miss based on a few little correlations that we have. But we all have to remember that El Nino and La Nina aren't everything, right? So there's only about, I'll say 50 more things that we don't completely understand that will influence what's going to happen.
And probably bears mentioning too that there are differences based on sector.
Right.
From an ag perspective, you know, a crop can get by with a little less soil moisture if you get a few rainfalls spaced along at the right time. It's a higher risk situation, but you can get by, you know, and not get hit really badly if you get rainfalls, even lesser rainfalls at the right time. If we're looking at overall amounts of water throughout the region from a groundwater stream flow standpoint, that's probably where we have some larger concerns, because we have background dryness that really we haven't alleviated yet. And if we, you know, and if we don't get some bigger amounts before summer sets in, that could stick with us and continue to cause problems.
Yeah, and just to hit on that a little bit more, there are some, I guess, municipalities around the Midwest that are watching that very closely, because they do realize that not necessarily agriculture, but for their municipality water supply, some of those deeper and stream flows actually, and reservoirs for that matter, are a little lower than they should be. And we've had 3 years of relatively dry, relatively dry from the point of view that the deep soil moisture, Dennis, hasn't been replenished the last 3 or 4 years. And so anyway, there are some places with 30, 35 inches less than they would normally have, below normal, I guess, for the last 3 years, last 36 months. Okay. There was a quick question, because we are all anticipating a cicada storm this summer. I don't know when that's going to begin exactly. Maybe the cicadas do, but I don't. It's all a ground temperature thing. But the question was, will soil moisture and higher temperatures and all that kind of business, will the incoming cicada bloom affect drought in any way, shape, or form? Dennis.
Boy, you're trying to make me an entomologist now, and that's a real stretch. I can't see any kind of connection there, and maybe what you're getting at there is, you know, we have had issues when you look historically with grasshopper infestations or things like that during major droughts, and we have had those. That's not been a common or widespread thing, sometimes out in the plains. I don't know of any relationship between those two. If we have any entomologists or any of the climate folks who have something they can point to, I'd love to hear it.
Yes. They're not defoliators like grasshoppers are. Amanda Bachman is telling us, and I have heard that too. They may. There's a few little things that they may eat, but I don't think they're anything like a Japanese beetle or a grasshopper in terms of danger. I have heard that bird populations will be extremely happy. I actually have heard that. So, sorry, we'll try to record some cicadas and put them on this one of these months. All right, moving on. Just wanted to, Matt from the Corps of Engineers wanted to point out that the low flow or low SWE years, snow water equivalent years, is now a patchwork of years, not a single year that depicts the lowest daily record anymore. So I didn't know that. I thought it was a particular year. He's just pointing that out to us.
Yeah, previously it was. They had individual years that were low and high. So thanks, Matt, for clearing that up. So
and then,
it wasn't year on there.
Yeah, and then the Australia Met Department has, if anybody follows the Australians or the Japanese for that matter, they both have Met Departments that we monitor as well. Actually, I don't, but the Climate Prediction Center from NOAA does. It has already declared El Nino is over and so neutral. But, you know, every country has its own set of indices that they follow for that, and the Australians use a different one, slightly different ones than we do here. Generally, we're on the same track, but not always in terms of what we call an El Nino and they call an El Nino, or La Nina for that matter. I think that what I heard was that a lot of the atmosphere, which is the important part, ocean is of course important, but the atmosphere over that ocean has become less reflective of El Nino. Is that right, Dennis? Is that what we heard?
I think so. And there was also a mention that previously there was a very deep layer of warm water that had been persisting for a long period of time. That has weakened appreciably. And I didn't show it. If you looked at the sea surface temperature plots, those were weakening and warming or cooling in the El Nino region very quickly. So yeah, at this point, it's more semantics as to who's declaring the end of it based on the data they used. Sometime within the next month, it's probably going to be gone.
Right. I don't know the answer to this one, Dennis. You may. Is NASA's GRACE soil moisture data using the same modeling as the one of the images shown today, like SPORT, or is it NASA model? How reliable are those products overall?
The NASA GRACE is not one that I look at regularly. It is using an interesting, it's satellites that the influence of gravity is slightly impacted by water and the soil and I say soil deeper profile. So that's what they kind of use along with some other modeling. All the models, and even the two that I showed, use somewhat different methods of modeling. So they're all trying to do a little bit different things. And that's why it's kind of nice, especially on these, to look at all of them and say, are you seeing the same thing or are you seeing different things? And if you're seeing different things, why are there different things? If you're seeing the same thing generally from different models, then you start to feel more confident that, yeah, this has a representation of what's going on overall. It would be great to have widespread in situ monitoring things, sensors in the soil that we could work with, but those are expensive and hard, a little bit hard to maintain. States are gradually ramping this up, and that will be a good addition as we go along. But for the purposes here, you know, we kind of show those two. We could show GRACE and say how it compares. GRACE also does, and these other ones too, we don't show the differences, have some different layers that they try to assess on how different layers are. They are generally okay. There's people like different ones for different reasons. I like NASA Sport because it tends to respond a little more quickly to things. It wets up and dries down a little more quickly. So I kind of like it from that standpoint.
Next question is about wind generally. High winds impacting eddy, evaporative demand. Yes, I believe they are taken into account. I'm not sure, Dennis, you can comment on that. And then a little surprised about the wildfire warning areas. for April, I'll say for April, because that's the only area or the only month of the next 3 or 4 that Dennis showed that have significant above normal wildfire potential. Okay, so I said a bunch of things there. So basically, significant meaning above normal, significant. It is typical this time of year where it is windy. When March is a windy month, and so is April to some degree. But it's also the time of year where before green up occurs, and that hasn't necessarily occurred in the northern part of the country. It's more likely to get a wildfire, especially if there's no snow cover, especially if it's been dry. So that's why that area up sort of Minnesota, eastern North Dakota, maybe into Wisconsin, if I remember correctly, was a little elevated compared to normal in terms of fire danger for April. Any other comments on that and high winds impacting Eddie?
The only other thing to add is remember that outlook would have been issued probably late March, so it's a few weeks old at this point, and has probably not been updated from that standpoint.
Yeah, those are updated on the 1st of each month or close to it.
Okay, yeah, so it's a couple weeks old.
Just a little more comment about the birds and insectivorous mammals are going to have lots of fun. So little mammals that crawl around and eat insects. Those are good things to have around, I guess. And snakes, maybe. I'm guessing on the snakes part. And frogs and toads. Anyway, another question here. Could you clarify the difference between indices? Evaporative drought development index and evaporative stress index.
Okay, they are both satellite-based assessments of what's going on at the surface. I don't remember enough details about either one. They are generally getting at the same thing, but evaporative stress is I believe where crops are getting stressed, where plants are being stressed, whereas Eddie is just saying how much more demand has the atmosphere on the surface trying to move water from the surface or from the plants. So that they're all kind of getting at a same thing, but they're trying to assess it in 2 different ways. They are based, like I said, based on remotely sensed data. There's probably some surface meteorological data that is included in this. We need to go dive into those a little bit more, and we have people who would be very happy to talk about this. The other thing is, it is satellite data, so it is probably influenced by a number of different things, different from just the surface data. So yeah, that's about as far as I can probably say to differentiate for you.
Yeah, and Imtiaz points out that wind is accounted for in Eddy, and the Eddy calculations. Winds are smooth. He says winds are smooth fields at 12 kilometers, and do not account for the patterns of wind at local scale. If that makes sense. The final question that we have at the moment, and Dennis, do you want to say anything more about crops in general across the north central U.S. before I do the final question? Because it's really, can we share this presentation, or can we share this presentation? The answer is yes to that. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I'll put a link in here to where you can go. Actually, Dennis, back up a slide. And there'll be a link there, so I don't have to type it in.
Okay.
So at the very
actually,
no, you have to go way back to the beginning, yeah.
Working there. Hopefully no one's getting sick watching this.
Well, we're already sick, Dennis. Okay, go ahead.
There we go.
Yeah, those 2 bottom links there go to regional climate centers. And if you go to those very specific links at those regional climate centers, you'll be able to find, you'll be able to download the PDF file of both of these. And Yeah, so we'll just leave that up for you if you want to copy that down. Anything else you want to say about, this is your chance, Dennis. This is April. This is your chance to talk about agriculture across the north central part of the U.S. So beyond what you normally do. So is there anything generally you want to say?
Yeah, I'll say, you know, with the Midwest Climate Hub, we do some ag folk, something kind of like this, but in a written format where we talk about ag issues. You can just Google Midwest Climate Hub Ag Outlook or Midwest Climate Hub, and you can see these. So far early in the season, no one, you know, there is this latent background concern about drought in some of the areas and what could be coming. From a near-term standpoint, most people are feeling fairly good where they are. And I would expect, you know, a lot of ag activity to be kicking up over the next couple of weeks or so here.
Okay. Okay. Yep. And we're going to actually finish a little early today. So I do want to thank you, Dennis, for doing this. Appreciate your time and effort. Of course, it takes some of that. And we'll be back next month with Justin Gleason, who is the state climatologist for Iowa, to give an update. May will be an important month, as you all know, especially from an agricultural point of view, but also from smoke and wildfire and water supply and everything else. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dennis, again.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.